Good afternoon again to each and every one. Allow me to share with you my understanding on the significant role of TRF or Teacher's Reflection Form relevant to the accomplishment of our IPCRF 2021-2022. First of all, we need the TRF in support of our rate for Appendix 3C or the rating sheet. Specifically, the indicators 8 and 9, which refer to how we manage and provide the needs of learners with disabilities, giftedness, and talents, as well as those who belong to the indigenous groups. The next we need to be aware of would be how to recognize and classify these learners who are gifted, with disabilities, or with talents, and those from indigenous groups. So kapag sinabi natin na gifted, we are actually referring to those with advanced skills, not to those who are physically handicapped. So we are referring to those who are fast learners or yung mga talented talaga or very creative in terms of learning and comprehending lessons we discussed. Those with disabilities naman would refer to learners who have physical, mental, social, or sensory impairment and cultural differences like mentally retarded, visually impaired, hearing impaired, with behavior problems, learning disabled, and many more. Meanwhile, when we talk about learners who belong to the indigenous group, we refer to learners who are with a little different customs, traditions, language, and cultural traits with that of among our common learners in the class. Halimbawa ng mga learners na ito would be the Lumads of Mindanao, the Igorots of Ifugao, the Mangyan, the Palawan tribes, and the Negritos. Kailangan alam natin how to identify these learners so we could also craft strategies to meet their needs. Ngayon, sa paggawa ng TRF, ano yung dapat nating i-consider so we could get the highest rate sa ating COT and sa ating IPCRF? For the COT rating sheet, let's look at the rubric for the indicator 8 and 9 under Appendix 3A of the RPMS tools. Kung makikita ninyo, nakalagay dyan, extensive repertoire was emphasized. So this means wide and comprehensive range of strategies. Hindi lang isa or dalawa, but more strategies to meet the special educational needs of the learners. Ginamit din ang term na special kasi we are talking about learners belonging not to the usual classification of learners, but those who are either advanced or physically, intellectually, and socially challenged. Siyempre, ang ating aim is to meet the highest rate, which is 7. In terms of feature of teachers' practice in the class, it was stated that to meet the 7's rate, the teacher has to understand the educability of the learners falling under gifted or challenged. Educability means variations in the learner's capacity to perform tasks, meaning the levels and ability of the learners in this group to comprehend and perform a class activity. Now let's move on to the indicator 9. As you can see, the same is expected from teachers in order to get a rate of 7. Extensive repertoire of strategies have to be employed in the class, or since we are dealing with TRF, it means from your response to the TRF. The rater has to see that you will be using a bunch of strategies to meet the needs of the learners belonging to the indigenous group. And in terms of feature of teachers' practice in the class, it was stated that to meet the 7's rate, the teacher has to demonstrate a wider understanding of a culture-based education. Ano naman ang ibig sabihin ng culture-based education? So when we say culture-based education, it is grounded in the context of the indigenous community's life, recognizes their indigenous knowledge systems and practices, and is inclusive of their cultural perspectives. Ibig sabihin, ang lesson that we discussed in the class dapat ay mai-relate natin sa kung ano yung nag-exist sa environment ng mga learners who belong to the indigenous groups. Now, for the IPCRF rate inputs, which will later on be discussed by my partner, Mr. Valiente, ito naman po ang dapat natin na i-consider. As ratee and raters, when we craft and give rate using the submitted TRF of the teachers for indicators 8 and 9 or objective 9 and 10 under the appendix 1A of the RPMS tools. For both the indicators or objectives, we have two means of verification of MOVs. We have set A from the COT, and set B is the utilization of TRF or the teacher's reflection form. However, it is highly possible that most of the teachers, especially the school year 2021-2022, might have not identified learners under indicators 8 and 9. As such, there is a greater need for the employment of TRF as part of our IPCRF. So let's focus then on set B, the use of TRF. Let's be familiar with this. According to this performance indicator tool, in using the TRF, the ratee has to secure a certification from the school head or signed by the school head confirming that there was no identified learner or learners with disabilities, giftedness, and or talents, as well as those belonging to the indigenous groups. So, kailangan pa pala natin ng certification coming from our Inang Marikit. But worry not, because I have already constructed a certification which we may all use and our Inang Marikit has already approved it. Next is for us to get level 5 or a rate of 5 in the IPCRF automated tool, which is an equivalent of a rate of 7 in the COT rating sheet. We have to be knowledgeable of the TRF rating rubric, which states the following. But of course, our target is the highest rate, which is 5. So if we want the outstanding, we just need to ensure that we have answered the TRF prompts by giving all the significant and necessary details to support the strategies we would mention to use in order to meet the needs of the learners under the COT indicators 8 and 9 or the IPCRF objectives 9 and 10. Some example of supporting documents and information expected from us would be the underlined, which are the reflections, annotations, or lesson plans. When we say annotation, it simply refers to the teacher's concise descriptions or explanation of how he or she utilized a certain strategy to meet the IPCRF objectives. Look at this teacher reflection form. The TRF consisted of two prompts, both for the objectives 9 and 10, or again the COT indicators 8 and 9. For the objective 9, prompt 1, here it is. We are provided with a situation to analyze and reflect on, and the situation reads, Clara is often seen restless or unfocused in class. She also has troubles following instructions and skips activities when left unsupervised. You had a conference with her parents and found out from them that Clara was diagnosed with a learning disability. How will you modify the instructions for Clara to keep her focus on classroom activities? Write your reflections in this form. Mention in your reflections a specific learning disability that you are familiar with or have research on. What you are going to do is to write your reflection on how you would deal with the situation stated in the prompt. Also consider that the instructions stated that a maximum of 500 words for our reflection is required, meaning It could be as short as less than 500 words. It doesn't have to be very long, but it must be concise, including all the necessary information that would support our claim of how to effectively deal with the situation mentioned in the prompt. For instance, if I am to reflect on that situation, these are what I am going to write in the form. First, I would take note of a specific learning disability I noticed Clara might be suffering from, as she had demonstrated during my class time. I could do a research on the classifications of learning disabilities, then annotate one which I believe is relevant to Clara's situation. So here is an example of my response to the TRF. As you can read from it, I mentioned that I researched a particular learning disability which I believed Clara, my student, might be suffering from. And then I provided short descriptions of the learning disability I have identified. The next that followed, of course, were the strategies I would employ in the class to help Clara learn, the same time the other students in the class do so. I enumerated some of the strategies that I would be using. And that is an example of how we can answer the prompt 1 of the TRF. By the way, when I checked on the number of words of that reflection I made, it was only 320 words. Yet I believed that the information I included was all significant and completely supporting my idea of how to effectively deal with the situation of Clara, who is a learner with special needs. The second prompt would task us to write a lesson plan. As the instruction states, design a lesson plan for the gifted and talented learners based on your idea on how they may be addressed in your class. Your strategies for the gifted and talented learners must be highlighted and annotated in this form. Attach your lesson plan here. To make it easier for us, we may connect our response here to our response to prompt 1, meaning to say, we may create a lesson plan to meet the needs of Clara in prompt 1. We may show in the lesson plan how we can incorporate the strategies we mentioned in prompt 1. Let me just also clarify that the sample I am going to present is not a complete lesson plan, but just parts of the lesson plan that I have created, since it's going to take me so much time if I will be presenting the whole lesson plan. Now look at these examples I made. If you have noticed, I added classroom setup because I planned to modify the seating arrangement of a student with special need, who is Clara in prompt 1. I did mention in the annotation what I will do before the start of the class discussion. In the next part, which is the class discussion proper, you will see that I use visual cues or pictures to help Clara understand well the lesson for the day. And that is how we may fill out the TRF prompt 1 and 2 for objective 9. The same process is what we have to do for the objective 10, which also have 2 prompts. For objective 10, prompt 1, we'll assign teachers or us to analyze a certain activity given to a class with indigenous learners. As expected, we are to write a reflection about it, just like what we did in Objective 9, Prompt 1. Upon analyzing the Prompt 1 of Objective 10, TRF, I suggest we choose the set B. Let's make our reflection on the effectiveness of set B as assessment activity for the class with indigenous learners. If I am going to reflect on that, since there are indigenous learners, I believe that the set B would be more applicable as assessment activity so that the indigenous learners would be able to use their background knowledge as the roles of Datu, community elders, and healers are evident in their culture. For the objective 10, Prompt 2 will again task teachers to draft a lesson plan that would show strategies of teachers in meeting the needs of the indigenous learners. We just have to repeat the process we did in Objective 9, Prompt 2, meaning to say, You are going to present here a complete lesson plan, and then you identify the parts of that lesson plan that tap on the indigenous learners and write annotations explaining how you had effectively helped the learners from the indigenous groups to actively engage in the class. And that is how we may respond to the teacher's reflection form, or TRF, which will be the basis of our rate for the COT indicators 8 and 9, or the IPCRF objectives 9 and 10. Thank you so much for listening and watching the discussion. I hope you learned something. Happy Monday, everyone, and God bless us all.